good morning and welcome to SISMEC Presents.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Well, we're honored to have you to talk about journalism and war in the Middle East on a lot of different topics, but we're just going to have an easy conversation and go from there.
Very good.
Jonathan Randal has seen his fair share of conflict in the Middle East and North Africa as a correspondent for the Washington Post, the New York Times, Times Magazine, and the United Press International, among other publications. He's covered wars large and small in Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Iraq, Kurdistan, Egypt, and Lebanon, among other places, including the Congo and Bosnia. There's so much we could talk about, but today I'd like to focus on covering minorities in the Middle East as a journalist. And if we could begin with talking about your new book about the 1982 Siege of Beirut, which you were there for. And I'm curious that you've written about Lebanon before, with Going All the Way in 1983, just after the war, but also 1997's After Such Knowledge, What Forgiveness, about the Kurds, and then Osama, The Making of a Terrorist in 2004. What will this new book contribute to the understanding of the little wars in Lebanon?
I think if the book works, and I'm not at all sure, I'm less sure now that I'm well into it than I was when I began it, and I'll explain why. I'll try to at least. What I was trying to do is to get people, the major actors involved in the Siege of Beirut, which at the time was a cataclysmic event, try to get the main actors to level with me and say what was really going on back then. Many parts of the world, but especially the Middle East, it doesn't suffice to just walk in cold and ask somebody a question. You've got to go back 10 times. So I figured 30 years later, if I asked those questions, maybe some of the defenses would fall and I'd get a little straight talk. I'm sorry to tell you, and sorry for myself, that isn't the case. I was trying to get the Israelis to talk, trying to get the Americans to talk, trying to get the French to talk, trying to get the Palestinians to talk, trying to get the Lebanese Christians to talk, etc. And it hasn't been very successful. And the excuse has been, well, there were so many terrible things during that period that, you know, we can't quite remember what you were talking about in 1982. Why are you attaching so much importance to that event? Well, the answer, the reason I wrote the book, and the reason it's important, is because had we realized, had the Israelis realized, had anybody else realized what went wrong in 1982, it's extremely doubtful that the United States of America would have invaded Iraq in 2003, and even more questionable whether the Israelis would have gone back into South Lebanon in 2006. In other words, why were the lessons unheeded? What were those lessons? Bad idea to invade your neighbor, a worse idea to stay around afterwards for 20 years, very bad idea to occupy an Arab capital. None of these lessons were learned.
And so you talk about going back to these sources. I'm curious if there are other sources besides people that you're talking to that you've used that perhaps not just declassified, but you know, things like that have been leaked, like WikiLeaks or anything like that, that you've used to look at it in a new.
I have a bit, but the absolute jewel document, the killer document, was discovered by an extremely fine young researcher who was doing a PhD at Columbia. His name is Seth Aniska, and he was wandering around the archives of the State of Israel and came across verbatim of some absolutely blood-curdling meetings between the United States and the Israeli government in the wake of the massacres in the Sabra and Shatila camps, which was the culmination of this terrible error the Israelis made in invading Lebanon. And those documents are just, I mean, they're so blood-curdling, it's amazing that the Israelis would have kept them. They're usually quite clever about keeping them out of sight. They are extraordinary documents. But to answer your question, a lot of the, you know, what happens with documents is that they seemed very important at the time. The little increments, today we try to get somebody, Mr. X, to do Y. In a way they don't really add much, especially if you had been, as I was, a witness in West Beirut to what was going on. And it really took this extraordinary young man who had an extraordinary stroke of good luck to come up with these documents, which I've never read. I mean, if you put it in a novel, you wouldn't believe it.
Truth is stranger than fiction, I guess.
Indeed. But as I always say about the Middle East to young correspondents going out there for the first time, only believe what you see and then only believe half of it.
Was there anything that you were surprised with while making the book, when you were putting it together, looking at this blood-curdling, this document that was found by the Columbia journalism, or Columbian PhD student, but was there anything that surprised you, having been there, that maybe you didn't see?
Yeah, I was in the inside in West Beirut. I was getting shelled and bombed, and I was trying to keep alive.
They bombed your hotel room, right?
Yes, among other things. But one of the things that I didn't realize, or if I did realize, I didn't attach correct importance, the whole diplomatic effort between the Americans, specifically between the Americans and the Israelis, to try to solve the problem of the siege as humanely as possible. There's an enormous argument, a raging argument between Philip Habib, who was this rough, tough, Brooklyn-born, rough diamond of a diplomat, brought out of retirement because by the fact he had a bad heart, and this bigger-than-life, literally and figuratively, Israeli general Ariel Sharon, who comes across as pretty bad character. We knew that they didn't like each other, but I had no idea what exactly was going on. Also, I had no idea at all the enormous argument going on inside the American government. This is a key thing. We are now 7 years after the American defeat in Vietnam, which took place in 1975. We're in 1982. The United States of America had stayed out of the Lebanon mess largely because the military was not, our military was not in any fit shape to do anything about it, and the American public had turned totally against the war. It's not a situation not unlike the situation today about the Afghan and Iraq adventures and the Syrian war. And as a result, there was this enormous screaming match between, to simplify it, George Shultz, who had been brought in after Al Haig's disgrace, Al Haig having been very pro-Israeli, screaming match between George Shultz, the new Secretary of State, and his man on the scene, Philip Habib, on the one hand, and Caspar Weinberger, the Secretary of Defense, and the Chief of Staff, the Chief of the Joint Staffs on the other, General Vasey. And this had nothing really to do with not anything directly to do with the Arab-Israeli dispute or the war. It was a feeling that on the Defense Department's, from the Defense Department's point of view, that this was a mess. We had no interest in it. There was no national interest in it. The Israelis had gotten themselves in over their heads, and it wasn't for us to do anymore to extricate from this mess than the very tough diplomatic work that Philip Habib had undertaken. Weinberger did not like, to put it mildly, Ariel Sharon. He thought he was a thug. And he also did not think America's primary interest in the Middle East had anything to do with the Arab-Israeli dispute. He was interested in oil and the Gulf. So there's this fight inside the American government with the State Department on the one hand, and I'll explain why in a minute, versus the Defense Department and General Vasey. And the argument basically turned on how long the so-called multinational force, that was the Western contingent, set in to ensure that the Israelis didn't misbehave and killed the Palestinians, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization troops, as they evacuated. I found proof now, which I didn't know at the time, that until 3 days before the evacuation began on the 21st of August, we had planned to stay for a month. Now, and as we'll see, the Americans got out a lot quicker than that. Now, why was that the crucial argument? Here's the reason. It was a complicated summer in Lebanon, and with the Israelis' help, the toughest, nastiest Maronite militia, known as the so-called Lebanese forces, had elected at gunpoint their own man, Bashir Gemayel. He was elected on the 23rd of August, 2 days after the evacuation, which lasted 10 days, began. But there was a hiatus. What was going to happen in West Beirut, which had been under, not very effective, but still real PLO control for years and years and years. You remove the PLO, who was going to maintain law and order in West Beirut? And more to the point, who was going to keep Ariel Sharon from going in there and doing what he eventually did? Sharon seized on the pretext when Bashir Gemayel was assassinated and entered West Beirut despite his formal promises in the form of peculiar agreements to evacuate the PLO, and I'll go into that in a second too. But the point was, everyone knew that Sharon would, if he could, get into West Beirut, and he had no interest in, he wanted to get the PLO out of there, and he wanted to get the Palestinian civilians out of there. So none of what happened later was a surprise. So why didn't it happen? Why was it that on the 1st of September, when the last PLO trooper leaves, why was it that Mr. Weinberger shows up in Beirut Harbor and says, mission accomplished, we're going to get out of here very soon? Remember, the idea was the American contingent, as with the French and with the Italians and the other powers involved, could stay up to a month. In the mind of Habib and Schultz, we had to stay there for a month to prevent Sharon from being, frankly, I'll call it the beast that he was. So what happened? There was an enormous argument in Washington, and Ronald Reagan hated to choose between friends. He had two very good friends in Weinberger and in Schultz. They were both from California, they were both Republicans, they both backed him to the hilt, they both worked for this enormous American construction company called Bechtel, and they both hated each other. And this was the beginning of a rivalry between these two men, and Weinberger won, quote unquote. The American troops left on the 10th of September, forcing the French and the Italians to leave, and on the 14th, the President-elect Bashir Gemayel was killed, and the Israeli army entered West Beirut, setting up what eventually happened in the massacre in the camps. So this is, I had no idea, no, I don't think anybody else did at the time. Those was, you know, if you're being besieged, if you're being shelled, you're trying to stay alive, and you're trying to vaguely follow what's going on the ground. But all this was going on between Jerusalem, Washington, and Beirut. And Phil Habib never talked to the press, very rarely talked to the press. I'd known him in Korea, I'd known him in Vietnam, I'd known him in the Paris peace talks for ending the Vietnam War. He just didn't like to talk to the press. There was no advantage to what he was talking to the press. Other people could talk to the press. Phil Habib didn't do that. So this tragedy unfolded partly because the Sharons, I'm trying to think of the polite word, Sharons obsession and partly because of a real policy difference inside the American government, which Reagan, as president, simply was not able to arbitrate. He chose not to do it. He hated to choose between his friends, and in that cabinet, those two men were very key people. They'd been with him since his run of the governorship in years before in California. He just could not choose between them, and the result, this tragedy happened.
Right now we have a similar, or maybe not a similar, but we have another tragedy unfolding in the Middle East, and you've talked about how it would have been important for us to understand some of the history leading up to the Lebanese conflict that we were just talking about. But I'm wondering today, the perspective and the power that one might get from understanding the history of Lebanon when we look at what's happening in Syria, with all of the different legacies, overlapping legacies of colonialism, Cold War militarism, proximity to Israel, and other forces in the region. So I'm wondering what kind of lessons you can get from your understanding of Lebanon, looking at what today is happening in Syria.
Lebanon went on for 15 years, these little wars that weren't so little at the end, before it finally ended. I know that country very well, and I have many dear Lebanese friends, and the country is still not recovered from the self-inflicted wounds of these so-called little wars. If you have a society made up of 18 officially recognized, religiously based communities, you have to be very careful about negotiating any kind of policies, foreign or domestic. The French had, to go back to the beginning, to answer your question, one has to go back to the end of the Ottoman Empire as a result of the First World War. The Turks, the Ottoman Turks, who had allied with the Germans, lost. The British and the French won and carved up the Middle East. The map of the Middle East, national boundaries, which we are shown on television and from time to time, all these are completely artificial, and they were invented in the wake of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This was especially true in Syria. Lebanon was of special interest to the French, the Christians in general, and especially the Maronite Christians, had long had relationships both with the Vatican and with France, going back hundreds of years. And when France, under the so-called Sykes-Picot Agreement, the names of the two British and French diplomats who designed it, when the Sykes-Picot basically carved up the area of the Ottoman Empire and drew these lines, the French at one point had 5 different units, political units. Greater Lebanon, which is the Lebanon we know today, which was adjoined to the so-called Christian mountainous country, Maronite Christians. It joined the south, which was basically Shia, and the part of the Bekaa, which was also Shia, with Tripoli in the north, which was a very old and important Sunni center, and Sidon, also a very important Sunni center. So all this was completely invented out of nothing, out of whole cloth. So much so that until very recently, Syria refused, as a matter of principle, to recognize the independence of Lebanon, saying you've carved up what once was an Ottoman province, and how dare you? The French also, classic case of divide and rule, an old colonial technique, created a Druze republic. The Druze are one of the sects who exist in Lebanon, in southern Syria, and also on the Golan Heights, which are now occupied by the Israelis. So there was a Druze republic. There was Greater Lebanon. There was a republic around Damascus. There was a republic around the great northern city of Aleppo. And there was another republic reserved for the Alawites. Now, the Alawites are a breakaway sect. In the last 40 years, they have been allowed to call themselves Shia. Whether they really are is open to question. I don't want to go into that. They lived along the mountains bordering the Mediterranean, and the French used them. I mean, one of the classic means of control for any colonial powers, especially when you have 70% of the population. These are guesses. There are no there's no real census. 70% of the population being Sunni, maybe 3 or 4% Druze. I've forgotten the Kurds as well. The Kurds about 10%. The Christians, question mark. The Alawites perhaps 10%. Well, if you...
It's just like in the Belgian colonial policy in Rwanda with the Tutsis, right? Or French North African colonial policy with the indigenous Jews there.
Or with the Berbers.
Or with the Berbers as well.
But all the more so since there were many more sects. I mean, there were more, it wasn't just one or two. You had this unending, well, not unending, but 5 or 6 distinct minorities. And traditionally, power exercised by the majority, in this case the Sunnis, has used and protected the minorities as a means of controlling the country. This became even more clear in the 1960s when the French, having encouraged the Alawites, having drafted them into the French colonial troops, left, and the Alawites seized power. They seized power through the military. They seized power also through the Ba'ath Party. Ba'ath means Renaissance. And the Ba'ath Renaissance Party said, we're all Syrians. So that wiped out all the difference. That meant an Alawite was just as politically powerful as a Sunni, which no Sunni would agree to. Remember, the Ottomans were a Sunni power. The Caliphate, the Sunnis were there. Most of the empire were the majority, and it was reversing what seemed to them to be the natural order of things to put this despised minority, the Alawites, in power. And the Alawites have been extremely clever in remaining in power. They've been in power one form or another since the 60s. It's a long time.
I mean, we're very curious about borders here in Arizona, but I wanted to know specifically, just looking at the Syrian conflict right now, and we'll get back to borders, if there are any big mistakes that you think journalism as a whole, from the West, from America, I guess, and maybe Europe a little bit too, are making in understanding the Syrian conflict today. If you see something, a myopic focus, or just some generalizations that aren't true, or are there any big mistakes that the media is making as we look at this very complex conflict?
Look, Syria is a difficult story to cover. Difficult to go in on the rebel side because they're not straight shooters either with the press. For a long time, it was all but impossible to go in on the government side. So you were relying on secondhand reports. We're living in the age of Twitter, YouTube, blogs, and both sides were very clever. The rebels more clever than the government at the beginning in manipulating opinion. The massacres were always the fault of the other side, except that they weren't, because that's not how things work in life, or in war rather. It's extremely difficult for the press to see clearly what was going on, largely because it was extremely dangerous. There are 18 Western journalists have disappeared, have been kidnapped, hostages. 18, that's an enormous amount. 60 or so Syrian journalists who were helping the Western press or themselves working for Arab media disappeared. I mean, it has been an extremely dangerous war to cover, and I'm not sure it was very well covered at the beginning. In the West especially, I think, and in our country, there was an understandable reluctance to get involved. The Assad rule had never, with increasingly less support in the West. And remember, the trouble started in Syria during this initial wave of Arab Spring before it turned into Arab summer, fall, or winter, depending on how pessimistic you are. And it was thought by policymakers, it is inevitable that the regime will fall. Well, that was a mistake by the regime, I think less so by journalists. Anybody who knew how the Assads had acquired power and how the period between 79 and 82 they put down a Muslim Brother revolt, very violently indeed, and among other places, did not think the regime would go down without a serious fight. This is a regime that, at least for the last 30 years, more than 30 years, has been preparing for just this kind of showdown. They got caught off base in 79 and 82, and ever since, the whole nature of their security organization is dealing with the possibility that there would be just this kind of thing. I don't think they knew exactly what form it would take, but the fact is, there is 4th Division, which is basically a presidential guard, all Alawite officers, a lot of Alawite troops. There are elements of the presidential guard per se, and among the army, which is very effective, but there are, at the beginning at least, the Assad family controlled the army. So they were going to go out fighting, and nothing suggests to me that they've changed their view. Superimposed on this was a feeling of revulsion in the West for the beginning of the repression. It shouldn't have come as any surprise to anybody who had followed the earlier period, but 30 years is a long time, and one can't expect the public necessarily to remember what went on, what seemed to them to be ancient history. But I think the United States could be faulted not for being standoffish, thinking that did we, the United States, want to get into yet another war in a Muslim country, but I think that also there was a policy decision in Washington which reasoned that there's a kind of geopolitical game going on. We had, quote unquote, lost Egypt with the fall of Mubarak, not that it was ours to lose, but never mind. And there was a feeling that the United States and the West in general could recoup if they could get rid of Assad. That would be a terrible blow against the Iranians, and our people in the American administration have always seen the Iranians as the devil incarnate. Why? It goes back to the beginning of the Iranian Revolution, the fact that our diplomats were held hostage for a very long period of time, and before they were released once Mr. Reagan was inaugurated president. So there was the feeling that if we could we could destabilize Assad, we would weaken Iran. In turn, that would weaken Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that would be good for our friends, the Israelis, our allies, the Israelis. And this superimposed on all that was the attitude of the Gulf Arabs, the Saudis, Kuwaitis, the Emiratis, Qataris, who were scared to death about Iran, and especially the possibility of an Iranian nuclear weapon. So you had this unholy, it's not my view, but in terms of orthodox Middle East analysis, what appeared to be this unholy meeting of the minds between the Saudis, the Israelis, the Americans, the West, and the Turks. I mean, it was so there were all these calculations at the beginning. We haven't talked about one other important factor, was the Russians. What were the Russians doing? At the beginning, I don't think the Obama administration had the slightest clue what the Russians were up to. And it's worth, if I may, going into some of the background for that. We've been trying to get rid of the Russians as a major factor in the Middle East for years, and we thought we had succeeded with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And all of a sudden, the Russians said, "No, we have interests. We have our Syrian allies. This goes lines that goes back a long time." And the Americans, I think, did not realize why the Russians were digging their heels in. And the reasons are varied. One of them goes back to the Clinton administration. Clinton, in order to ensure his re-election in '96, extended the borders of what had been the Soviet Empire all the way to the ex-Soviet Union itself. We gave all these little countries, the Latvia, Estonia, etc., Poland, not so little, Czechoslovakia, membership in NATO. And Clinton did it because he wanted to get the ethnic vote in the great Middle Western cities in which he thought there were a vestigial interest in the country of their grandparents, if not their great-grandparents. And the Russians looked at this as, once again, encirclement. The Soviets, the Russians, have, for the better part of a century, felt that the West was trying to encircle them. The Czechs had a brigade in the nascent Soviet Union. The British had a column that came in from Iran. We ourselves had Marines in Siberia. I mean, one forgets this thing. So for the Russians, here we are, the West doing it again. Very important. Then Putin, I think, also saw a possibility to reestablish his status as a Middle East power. It had nothing to do with what many commentators said was the importance of to the Russians of a rather small naval installation on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast. But it did have a great deal to do, aside from the factors I mentioned, with the Soviets' fear of jihadi activity in their former Muslim republics along the southern border of what had been the Soviet Union. Remember the Chechen War, Dagestan, all these jihadi activity. So at the beginning, there was a sort of standoff. The Americans said, well, Assad's going to go along the way of Mubarak, etc. The Russians said, no, he isn't. And I think what's happening now is that I hope, I base this nothing on more than sucking my thumb, I think there is a dawning realization in both Washington and Moscow that this war has gone on too long and that it's extremely dangerous for everybody. It's dangerous for the United States because we saw this very complicated footwork that was required to get President Obama out from what appeared to have been a promise to do something if the regime used chemical weapons. And on the Russian side, I think there was a real understanding that instead of being a place to draw the line about jihadi activity, their very policy is encouraging it. So there's a possibility of I go no further than that, of an understanding. Remember also that, just to go back to the early September, we remember the events were the 21st of August, the use of sarin in the suburbs of Damascus, and then Obama's discomfort. And then all of a sudden one day, it was Friday, I believe it was Saturday, Kerry, the secretary, said, well, this possibility, and within hours, the Soviet foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, said, yes, that's a very good idea. And by the way, my friend, the Syrian foreign minister, happens to be in Moscow. I mean, that didn't happen by chance. Obviously, there was fancy footwork going on between various capitals over a long period of time.
Mm-hmm. Waiting for it, yeah.
And one final thought on that. The nature of great diplomacy often turns on a paradox, and that is thinking up an idea yourself that you couldn't possibly put forward, but getting your adversary to put forward and make it works for both parties. And I hope this is what's going on.
It wasn't just a mistake, because I had heard that was the, I mean, it was touted in the Huffington Post as an example of a really good journalist who asked a question to Kerry, you know, if you could get the equipment out, but you're saying maybe it's more.
No, you know, that's total naivete. I mean, yeah. Look, I mean, this, the Russians and the Americans have been not at daggers drawn, but very opposed on what to do about Syria, but they've been talking to each other. And diplomacy still is a craft best done in the shadows. It's none of our business.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody comes up with an answer to a terrible problem, so much the better.
Mm-hmm. I just was thinking of it when you were talking about Sykes-Picot and the Russians. I mean, I remember Sykes-Picot's an agreement was leaked by the Russians originally.
Exactly. After the revolution.
Right. And I think it's very interesting to talk about these borders now, and I wanted to ask a question that came into my mind when reading Robin Wright's latest map of the Middle East. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
No, I know Robin very well.
Okay. So she wrote an article, and then the New York Times published this map.
Yes, I did see that, yes.
Which had Libya being divided, had Saudi Arabia being redivided, it had Syria being broken up into like an Alawite stronghold, a Druze section. It I think reflects a larger maybe idea we have, not just in academia, but maybe popularly, that those borders that were drawn back in Paris in 1919 and maybe a little bit earlier are faulty. And so I'm wondering if you think that that's really what we're talking about here, what we're seeing in Syria, maybe even what we saw in Lebanon is the fallout of creating these arbitrary nations.
Yeah, I think we're in 1919. You know, the Ottoman Empire has just signed the Treaty of Mudros in November 1918, and all of a sudden people realize there's a new order. Well, it lasted more or less for 100 years. I think things are up for grabs. And one thing that you must keep in mind also is that it's always been an article of faith of Israeli policy that these great Arab neighbors of theirs who threatened them were at feet of clay, and it was called the mosaic policy because they were bits and pieces, mosaics. The Israelis always were hoping to use, I'll give you an example, the Israelis, long before the State of Israel, the Zionists in what then was British Mandate Palestine, were already talking to the Maronite Christians in Beirut, hoping to provoke them into breaking away and cutting a deal with what the Zionists then hoped would become the State of Israel. So even before the creation of the state, and there's a famous passage in the memoir, the papers of a former Israeli prime minister, in which he says, quotes Dayan, the great hero of the '67 war, saying, well, we can always buy a Christian major to carry out this rearrangement of the map. In fact, one of the horrible aspects of those little wars in Lebanon was the Israelis did find he happened to be Christian. He wasn't Maronite, but never mind. But he became, basically, he ran puppet troops for the Israelis in South Lebanon. So it's always been a possibility to break these states up. And the Israelis had something called the periphery policy, be on good terms with Turkey, although a Muslim power, be on good terms with Iran, although a Muslim power, Shia power, and also in Africa, Ethiopia, the good relations with Ethiopia, because you were trying to contain, cause problems for Arab regimes in Sudan, everywhere from Sudan to Iraq. The Israelis were fooling around in Iraqi Kurdistan, starting in the early 1960s. Why? Because they wanted to create problems for the strongest military power in the Arab world. It was always fair in love and war. So it's nothing new under the sun. Now, the real question is, once we've drawn these maps, and had fun saying, oh, aren't we clever? I think one should not underestimate, despite everything that's happened, 100 years of history. I think it's very tempting to say, oh, these maps are artificial. They were drawn up in Sykes-Picot with the Russians. The foreign minister was a man named Saranov. You were quite right in saying when the Russian Revolution happened, one of the first things he did was to publish these accords. WikiLeaks of its time. But there's been 100 years of history, and people do feel, in part of their souls, that they have become citizens of these countries, which on paper still look fairly artificial. So the worst is not always inevitable. One should be careful. That said, I think things have gone so far in both Syria and, for that matter, in Iraq, that maintaining the unitary nature of these governments is becoming more problematic. One of the unfortunate legacies of the French Revolution was in the years following the end of the Ottoman Empire, a desire for very strong central government, and in distinction to what they thought had held them back, which was empires ruling minorities. So there's an element of contradiction right there. And right now, can anybody put Syria back together? How bad are events in Iraq? Nobody really knows, but I suspect it's more difficult. You just don't. There is a weight of an inherited weight of what's the word I'm looking? Not tradition, but
almost identity.
Identity. Yeah. So that it's what certainly is true is that these wars have destroyed the nature of minority power. Did so in Iraq. Iraq was ruled under the Ottomans by a Sunni Arab minority. After nominal independence in the 30s, that became more marked. Certainly under Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party, the Sunni Arabs were everything. They were power. They were the people who ran the army. They ran the bureaucracy. They knew how to do things. They were They traveled abroad. They were educated. Basically, it was a regime set up for them. And in Syria, an even smaller minority, the Alawites, had come out from centuries of mistreatment and were organizing themselves. They allied themselves, beginning with the Sunni business elite, then with the minorities, and they put together quite an effective rule. But Lord Acton teaches us that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and these regimes became sloppy and lazy and corrupt. And unlucky. I mean, unlucky. Take Syria. One of the elements that I think has been overlooked is that, or underplayed, is that there were terrible crop failures in Syria. The result was a lot of people who had been dependent on rain-fed agriculture came into the suburbs of Aleppo and of Damascus. This is exactly what happened in Beirut, because Israeli PLO tensions along their border, a lot of the southern Shia went to shanty towns around Beirut. It was sort of a collar of diamonds is known as a choker. I mean, and that was literally a choker. And very much the way in Damascus, a lot of the problems in the suburbs are due to the fact that these are people who have been uprooted, who felt that they weren't getting even under the rough justice of the Sunni Arab Ba'ath rule, were not getting their fair share of things. That kind of floating population is open to all kinds of temptations. And also, there's the age-old tension between the cities and the countryside. In the Arab world, this often meant the razzia, the raid, go steal the wealth of the cities. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun.
Well, on that note, I think we could talk a lot about like Kurdistan, which I'd love to hear maybe more from you after this interview, but I'd like to ask a very open-ended question about the nature of journalism and the changes that you've seen in your career. I mean, you started not quite with I mean, you started a very long time ago with very different machines than that are available now, and different modes of production and different organizations controlling and broadcasting and printing the media today. So we have a, you started in 1957 with United Press, right? And then so we've seen the decline of UPI, to closing of many foreign desks in the Middle East, to new technology like the 24-hour satellite news networks and digital platforms like Al Monitor in Lebanon, or blogs like Foreign Policy's Middle East Channel. The university professor up here, you probably know him, Mort Rosenblum.
Very well.
Okay.
If I'm here, it's all his fault.
So he repeatedly charges that foreign reporting is being destroyed by bean counters, or managers willing to pay stringers and freelancers very little to go to dangerous places instead of trained correspondents. And in a sense, this is an outsourcing of foreign reporting to an economic elite of independent journalists in combination with educated local fixers or stringers. But I guess with that point that he's making, with this kind of war tourism that some young journalists are starting, and also the nature of this business pulling back funds from the front lines essentially, and letting people kind of figure it out for themselves in this free market rush for the front line. Is that really something new? Is that really different than...
Yes and no. Mm-hmm. No in the sense that for at least the last 150 years, if you were an ambitious young journalist and wanted to make your name, the easiest way to do it was to go cover war, and you were badly paid for your trouble. And if you survived, and if you pleased your colleagues by co-option, they would help you start a real career. That has remained basically the same. I mean, I was very struck this summer. It was astoundingly moving, I found, testimony by a young Italian woman who works as a stringer in Aleppo. And Aleppo's a nasty, dangerous place. And she was saying, you know, I've been here for, what, a year and a half or so. I really know what's going on. It's a very complicated story. It's very important. What's going on here has political and human ramifications. But the only thing, when somebody calls me, wants something, it's always blood, you know. And here I'm risking my neck for $70 a pop. Well, I sort of giggled to myself in a macabre way, because I wasn't even making $70 a week when I started for UP before it became UPI. But there is that feeling that, you know, you're gun fodder, cannon fodder. It's expensive to keep foreign correspondents abroad. It's expensive to keep a core of foreign correspondents abroad. Remember what obtained for, you know, for years and years and years and years, that there was a core of people. I mean, you may have been starting out the correspondent in North Africa, and then you perhaps went to Eastern Europe, and then you perhaps went to the Far East, and then you came back and lucky were in Paris. I mean, it was a kind of movable village, a revolving circle of people. I mean, I kept meeting the same men, and then as the profession became more feminized, the same men and women from one conflict to another. And we were pretty good bunch. I mean, good bunch in the sense that we've been around the block, and it was very difficult to be taken in. There was some very good, tough reporting in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, in the beginning, you know, before the economic crisis caught up with newspapers. So that, yes, there is a real crisis there. Your first point about your question was the nature of the machines. You know, when I first started out, I had to figure out what the loiter time was. There were no, I had to get back to the cable point. Quite often it was a cable. Sometimes it was a telex if you were lucky. But so I had to go out in the day and figure out, I can only stay that amount of time because I've got to get back and file. So I used to get up very early in the morning, and get going, because I knew I had to be back by a certain time to file. And that was a limitation. And then, quote unquote, progress took over. And it was both good and bad for the correspondence. Let me explain. First thing I noticed was direct dial telephone. So your editor could call you at any hour of the night or day. When I started out, even the telex machines in a lot of third world countries stopped at 9 o'clock at night. There was no way your editor could find you. You could go chase girls, get drunk, read a book, go out and meet people, have discussions, or sleep. But the point was, there was downtime, even within a 24-hour circle. And you were not expected to do more than write a story or take a photo. You were not supposed to be, you weren't being multitasked. And I have nothing against multitasking, but the fact that there are only so much time, only so much reporting time in a day, and no matter how good your generation is at these various mind gadgets, they're time consuming. So it's cutting down on the amount of time you can go out and listen and get confused and go back to that source and try to pin things down. Reporting depends on people, the people you trust and the people who trust you. And to the degree that machinery or the social media are more and more important, it means you're not dealing with people. I'm told now, for instance, I asked somebody recently about a story. I said, who did you talk to about that story? And she laughed and said, I didn't talk to anybody. It was the statement on Facebook. I mean, there's no way to ask the follow-up question, to refine the questions, to try to extract more information. And these are very powerful instruments, not only among others, in the hands of government. You know, they say what they want to say, and they don't answer your questions. So that progress is a mixed blessing. You know, when I first, as I said, I started off, the telex was a great luxury, then the phones, then the first very cumbersome computers, something called a Trash 80, which was a Radio Shack, which ran on flashlight batteries, and you could send it 300 baud a minute. 300 baud a minute is about, I think it's 66 baud a minute, so it was on telex, so you were sending 4 or 5 times faster even on this simple Trash 80 computer, then you were no longer a prisoner of the telex, because with the telex you had to wait your turn, you had to punch a tape. It was great wads of tape, which you then had to wait your turn to feed through the telex machine, and then you had to be sure that it was well received at the other end before you could call it a day or a night. So when computers happened, it was great freedom. You know, you wrote the thing, off it went. At the beginning it was only, say, 350 words a minute, but that was wonderful progress, and it just cut down on all the logistics. So that each new instrument, means of communication, has good sides and bad, but it's certainly changed. You know, satellite telephones were, the first satellite telephone I saw was as big as that, you know, it was like as big as an ice box, or maybe 3 ice boxes. And then they got smaller and smaller. Then during the Gulf War '91, people had something called the Thuraya, which was a super satellite phone. Now you can call, you can basically use a cell phone in many places. So that part of things has become much easier. Has this changed the nature of reporting? Probably. For the better, probably, in terms of at least allowing the correspondents to get some sleep. When I first started out, there were very few women involved, and the women who were involved were sort of supermen. Wonderful woman named Claire. God, I was just thinking about Claire. The name will come back to me. Who started out in 1939. She was in Germany, and discovered the Germans were about to invade Poland. You know, she just started out. She got the scoop of it. Wow. Claire Hollingsworth, absolutely great woman, but tough as a boiled owl. I mean, very tough, much better correspondent than any of the men. And many of the young women who came along were terrific correspondents. Mm-hmm. Remember, in the third world, there's a double standard. Women are nothing, but they're allowed to do many things. You know, I'll give you an example. A very good, young, to me, woman, Belgian woman, named Pascale Bourgault, has done an absolutely magnificent documentary on an Afghan warlord. And she went back 5 times over 10 years, and you see what happened to the man, and how his power was whittled away, and how he had been fighting the Taliban and ended up playing the game, turning in his heavy weapons, being a good boy, and having the Taliban come back, and finally creating problems within his sons and diminishing his power. It's the question, how did she do this? Well, she was a woman. She started off with the women in his family. She became pals with the women. The women then said to the boss, she's okay, you can talk to her. So this is an enormous advantage for being a woman reporter. As well as that, I think they're more careful, and they're quite often more sensitive.
Well, I want to thank you a lot for your time
Not
today
at all.
talking to us. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to reading the new book.
Yeah, well, I hope I could finish it before it finishes me.